Dads? Your boy Big Dave back with another episode of Culture Dads, Age of Sword and Cassette. What's going on, Mr. Mike? We got something very interesting to talk about today.
Yeah, this is going to be a good topic, man. I'm doing all right. I'm a little bit behind schedule here. I've had some things kind of come up, and this latest article I wrote on the Substack actually took a few extra days, and I didn't get my couple of days a week of like actually sitting down and fucking working because I just had to take care of the kids and stuff. So those things kind of put me back a little bit, but I'm on top of it now, and I am stoked about this. This is going to be a really cool episode. Some pretty cool stuff to talk about. A little bit different from what we normally talk about, too.
Yeah, we usually, like I said, we usually do something pop culture related, right? We do movies and music and what have you, different things. But once in a while, we pop out with one that is history related. And we wanted to talk about today kind of not just World War I, but the mechanization of warfare and where that led in the greater scheme of things.
Yeah, it really is an epic-making topic. A lot of what is going on today, geopolitically, culturally, and technologically, can kind of be traced back to this pivotal sort of like axial moment in our history. I mean, for lack of a better term, it really was a kind of turning point. The late 19th to early 20th century, there was a lot of things going on at this time, philosophically, aesthetically, culturally, and of course, politically. So, I mean, a lot of people sort of think of that as kind of the big bang of like true modernity. I mean, obviously, when we talk about the modern period, the early modern era, this is around the era of like Shakespeare and things like Elizabethan times. That's the early modern era, or maybe slightly after it. But true modernity kind of begins in the wake of World War I. So yeah, this is something important to talk about. If we want to understand the modern world, if we want to understand where we are and why things are happening and all the currents that are sort of at play today, this is something we truly do need to understand. If we want to understand culture, we have to understand this turning point.
Yeah. And World War I was less of a war and more of an arms race. If you go and you look into World War I, I've said this before, and this gets said a lot about the war, is the soldiers arrived on horseback and left on planes. They came home on planes, and when they landed in their countries, they came home to alien worlds. Like their society, the way technology shaped their society when they came home was completely different.
Yeah, and they were different too. Like the experience of war totally changed them. Going into this, people they had an attitude about war that had kind of, could be traced back to archaic times. This kind of romanticized notion of war, that dying for your country was something glorious, and by the end of it, I mean, things had completely changed. The game had totally changed. The culture of warfare and like military culture itself was kind of, there was a no turning back moment here. So definitely important, and a real axial moment, as I said.
Yeah. Now, there obviously were wars before World War I that were gruesome and bloody and were changed. For example, the American Civil War was, I live in Pennsylvania, just not that far away from me is Gettysburg, like one of the bloodiest battles actually is the bloodiest battle in American history, and was one of the bloodiest battles of the time. It was, we're talking, tens of thousands of men getting hit with cannons, and they had Gatling guns, and this was kind of like the very first inventions of modern warfare was in the American Civil War. And I'm sure other wars elsewhere that were around this time when you started to really get more advanced gunpowder weapons, As I mentioned, cannons and Gatling guns was the big change, and the Gatling gun was really what changed World War I as well, because the guy that invented the Gatling gun, or I guess he improved it or whatever, he bought up a British company that manufactures stuff. It's called Maxim, and he created what was called the Vickers 303. And the Vickers 303 was a water-cooled machine gun. It was based off of the Gatling gun, except unlike the Gatling gun, it could run for a long time, right? Because it was water cooled and you could change out the barrel. So you could literally run this thing for a long, long time, and it shot a lot faster. We're talking I can't remember how many rounds, but it was like something like 5,000 rounds a minute or whatever. It was belt fed, right? This was the first machine gun as we understand machine guns. Now it was stationary. It's not like what guys are carrying around now with saws and stuff like that. It was like a 50, 60 pound weapon that needed to sit on a tripod. It was static. However, this was a nasty, nasty weapon. This was something that it was anti-personnel. This is what changed the battlefield, because instead of like older styles of warfare, right? Even if you look at the Civil War, Revolutionary War, I'm mostly only familiar with American wars that America was involved with. So I'm sorry to you guys out there from other countries that are like, oh, what about this? That's just beyond my research. Even back in those wars, when you had muskets, there was still quite a bit of melee combat. You were still pretty likely to go home. You go back even further to the ages that we think of glorious warfare and all this with the ancient battles with swords and pikes and spears and shields and armor. Those battles, first of all, they were much smaller. Medieval armies were very, very small by our standards today. We're talking sometimes like a few dozen guys, like squaring up against each other, or maybe even just like a few hundred was a big war, because they didn't have, this was a big thing as well for World War I. They didn't have trains to ship in thousands and thousands of men from all over the place. They couldn't do that. They had to just kind of like spring up whatever men at arms are in their locality and then just go for it. And also, in medieval warfare, a lot of people don't realize this. By today's standards, medieval warfare was very safe. It was very safe. If you got, they didn't have grenades they actually did have grenades. They had grenades and they had some gunpowder stuff. They had some of very archaic, primitive versions of what we understand to be artillery, right? But it wasn't in wide use. You're not going to see it on most battles. It was something that was really reserved for really big sieges, really notable wars and battles. There was this stuff employed. So in the average medieval war, you would pull up, right? And you'd have your own kit. You'd bring your own stuff. This is before like state issued equipment. So you would have your own kit, you had your own stuff, and you pull up, and you're very likely to survive, right? A sword, a spear, an arrow does not have the same killing capacity as a Vickers 303 or a grenade or a trench gun. So fast forward to World War I. First of all, the thing that really shapes World War I is the rail system. Now, I'm not going to go too far into what started it and all this kind of stuff. The thing with Franz Ferdinand, and then you have Tsar Nicholas and Kaiser Wilhelm, and these guys. It's actually really tragic because these guys are actually like related. They were cousins, and they didn't want to fight. They were kind of pressured into it, and then there's like some mishaps. It was like Tsar Nicholas like ordered these guys to leave on trains to go to war because he's like they forced his hand, and then he's like he's got a letter from his cousin. He's like, I don't want to fight. And he's like, yeah, but the train was already gone. He couldn't get on his iPhone and call and tell him to turn around. It was like they were already gone. So the war started, and it's a really unfortunate thing. But the railways are what really in the beginning shaped World War I, because it's the first time in history that guys from all over continents could be efficiently shipped in very large numbers to a location, right? Think about it. Traveling and logistics like this were not, you couldn't do it without trains. Instead of, a couple hundred guys like having to travel on foot across however long, and they were very limited by, how far their bodies could take them. Instead, you have guys that load up on trains by the thousand, and then sit on the train, and then they pretty much just end up where they have to be completely fresh, no traveling. So they importing tens of thousands of soldiers to single places really, really was already a different thing. Now, like we said before, in the beginning, you had your rifles. Your soldiers had your rifles, but they were still pretty archaic, right? We're talking. I don't even know if M1 Garand was out at that time. It was like I'm not sure what rifles were around, but they were not. They weren't 70. We're talking bolt action rifles and shit that were available to these guys. But they get to the battlefields, and right away, because of the Vickers 303, and then later the Germans came out with I can't pronounce it, machine viewer, the MG08, right? So because of these machine guns that have incredible range, they literally just lay down fire at all times. They pin you down to a location. So this is where trench warfare came from, right? And trench warfare was completely different than anything that these guys were familiar with. Nobody's ever done it before, and that's how they fought. It was fucked. And on top of it, now that they're pinned down with the machine gun fire, they had to dig these trenches. One of the generals wrote in his diary, he said that hell is not full of fire. Hell is full of mud. And that's what he was talking about, because the mud and the wetness and all of the stuff that went along with trench warfare was grim, man. We're talking. I watched a really cool interview. You guys should check it out. It's on YouTube. It's an interview with an Irish World War I veteran, and he talks about his experience there. His brother died. His friends all died. It was fucked. And he talks about being in the trenches is a nightmare, because what happens is, since they're just laying down machine gun fire the whole time, you have to just sit in the trench. And what happens is, guys get shot and killed, and they lay in the trenches, and you can't move them, because if you stand up, they'll blow your head off. And especially early on, this is an invention in World War I that a lot of people don't realize. They invented steel helmets. They didn't have steel helmets going into that. But after a few months in trench warfare, where every time a guy would pop his head up, it would get blown off. Like, maybe we should get a helmet. So the English first developed the Brody helmet, which was that kind of like that pan shape looking thing, almost looks like a Chinese hat or something. And then you have the Germans with their was that the Haub helmet. So these guys developed these steel helmets. So there's like a lot that this was like an arms race. This was like developing, figuring it out as we go during this thing. But in the trenches, this guy was talking about. He says one of the things that you had to worry about in the trenches was the rats, because they ate corpses. They were so sick with disease, and if you got bit by one of these rats, it was bad news. He said that he saw a young man got bit on his face when he was sleeping by one of these rats, and his skin turned black, and his throat and his neck like ballooned up, and he died probably of infection in like 2 days. So not only was all of that, you had trench foot, right? A lot of people don't realize what trench foot is. It's when your foot is in your boots for so long and so wet for so long that your skin peels off. So on top of all of this, they also have to experience artillery. The French were the first ones to introduce it. They had this 76 millimeter cannon. This is the first artillery. It was very efficient. It could shoot over a long range. It was the first artillery, but it was the Germans called it the devil's gun, because it was an anti-personnel weapon that they used it for. Later, the Germans came out with something that was even better. I forget what it was called, but it was like an even better one. And then it was on and on and on. And they eventually started, on top of machine gun fire, now you have artillery artillery striking around you at all times. And this is where you get shell shock, right? Shell shock is, you know, a lot of people would make it like it's PTSD or whatever, but shell shock has more. It was a condition that was unique to World War I because of the amount of artillery strikes that were happening. You know, it is PTSD, but think about it like this: you're sitting there, you're like just waiting to die. Boom, 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 all around you, and any second one of these things drops on you. This isn't the type of warfare that men were built for, right? Because if you go back and you go to in the Renaissance or even the wars during the colonial times where they still had muskets, you had guys that would charge in, and there was a lot of bayonet fights, there's a lot of melee, it was still sort of familiar, right? You could still charge in and be a man and like do warrior shit. In World War I, it wasn't like that. It was sit there, shoot, wait, pray not to die. And on top of it, they had gas, which was a big thing, right? There was something like 20%. It was like 20% of all soldiers were wounded from gas. Gas was, first of all, there was like this Treaty of Hague or whatever, and gas was actually deemed unethical to use, but they started using it anyways. The Germans started with mustard gas, and then the British developed chlorine gas, and this stuff was nasty. I'm sure you guys have swam in a pool that has too much chlorine. Now imagine that completely concentrated and put into a gas form. It sears your eyes. It trashes your lungs. You can die. If you don't get your gas mask on fast enough, you have a miserable death of asphyxiation, a painful, searing, burning death where you don't even get to look anybody in the eyes, right? So this is the kind of warfare that we're looking at here: machine guns, artillery, trenches, lots and lots of death. We're talking 40 million people died in this war. That number was unfathomable at that time. They didn't even know, if depending on where you were from, you couldn't even fathom the idea that there were 40 million people in the world. And in this war alone, 40 million people died, 40 million men died. So it was really nasty stuff. And we can get into, there's tanks and planes and U-boats, and, communications was a big deal as well. So we can get into some of that, but I want to let Mike hop in because I've been yakking and yakking.
Yeah, well, World War I is the war that is kind of, in some ways, most distant from us than even it's certainly for Americans, the Civil War, or like the Napoleonic Wars, or some of the earlier ones as well. It's that war that everyone knows is just really bleak and terrible and gray and ugly, but people are not really sure why it happened, or what the motivations were, and the context and the background of it and everything like that. So you've done an excellent job, Dave, of sketching out the sort of what it looks like on the ground in the moment, like this is what you're up against kind of thing. And we alluded at the beginning to some of the changes that that happened from, earlier warfare to this kind of trench warfare. But I think it'd be good to just quickly rewind and sort of like sketch out a little bit of the background and the context of what was kind of going on here, or how it came to this, without going into the geopolitical machinations, which were extremely complicated. I mean, in a nutshell, it's almost a cliche that Europe was a powder keg of these fragile and hyper complicated alliances, where any change could set off a domino effect, a chain reaction that could lead to war. So when it happened, everyone knew it was coming. But the origins of it go back quite a ways, actually. I mean, this World War I was basically, from the broadest historical perspective, this is war basically at the peak of Western civilization. This is the major war that happened when we, as a larger folk group, were kind of at our peak, at our height. There's also a kind of an interesting term that gets used. It's called the long 19th century, and it stretches from the French Revolution, 1789, to the outbreak of World War I in 1914. And this really does sort of tell you kind of like, that these two things are kind of bookends to a very, very important period. But yeah, so this is war at the peak of Western civilization. It was building since the advent of the Industrial Revolution. So even though we're not big on the Enlightenment in these parts, I certainly am quite anti-Enlightenment and anti-liberal, and I know you are too, Dave. But this is, I mean, I can't stress this enough. This was really the peak of technical innovation and biological superiority. I mean, the people that lived at this time, the average person, it's probably the case that the average person had what we would now consider to be about a 130 IQ. That's like verging on genius level. This was the man in the street, right? Like, these are very impressive people who had the social technology to do very impressive things. And of course, this gave us modern science and all these other things. What I want to stress is that this is not caused by the Enlightenment. This is sort of it's almost like something that we could afford as a result of the, what was built up through the Middle Ages and everything. But without going into all of that, we had the Industrial Revolution, and this started in the 18th century for the most part, and really picked up steam in the 19th century. This was a time when, without going into the details of why the Industrial Revolution happened, this is where we get the greatest innovations, certainly at the fastest acceleration and the fastest speed of innovation of any time probably in human history. At the peak of our Europeans' genotypic health, all of this genius, all of these innovations, all of the social technology was set to the task of killing people as efficiently as possible in World War I. So there was some cultural factors as well that are important to note. The Enlightenment that somewhat preceded the French Revolution, but really the French Revolution was kind of its culmination. Enlightenment rationalism, very soon after the French Revolution, became a kind of joke, really. The French Revolution yielded the Reign of Terror, and the Reign of Terror yielded eventually the Napoleonic Wars. So up until this point, from, let's just say, the scientific revolution, from around the time of Copernicus and Newton, the beginnings of it, all the way to the Enlightenment itself, roughly in the latter half of the 18th century, man was seen as this fundamentally rational creature that could be perfected and that was constantly being improved. And especially now with the Enlightenment, the supposed, as Enlightenment, man sort of waking up from his slumber, from his, as Kant called it, man waking up from his immaturity and becoming a fully fledged rational adult. From that to the Napoleonic Wars, where basically there was no evidence whatsoever as man as a rational creature. Lust for power was absolutely rampant. Ideals were thrown over for power. Cruelty was everywhere. Man was clearly motivated not by high-minded ideals, but by naked opportunism. It became very clear that man, rather than being this rational creature halfway between the apes and the angels, was just a brute animal. And this sort of waking up from this fever dream of Enlightenment utopianism led to Romanticism, which was in some sense a kind of black-pilled movement, but also very high-minded in its own way. And it led to irrationalism, which kind of came towards the latter half of the 19th century, especially after the Franco-Prussian Wars. Mysticism, so you think of people like Blavatsky and all of the like crazy mystical like currents, Crowley in the early 20th century, although that's a bit later. All this stuff was kind of like this brew, this burbling brew that like intersected with political radicalism, led to a feeling of pessimism. And this feeling of pessimism is known as the fin de cycle, the end of a cycle. That this was about the very late 19th century, early 20th century. There was a feeling of malaise and depression in the air. It's interesting because, as I say, this is sort of the peak of Western civilization. There was so much interesting philosophy and technical innovation going on at this time. It's amazing to think that these people thought that the whole thing the ship was sinking at this stage. But anyway, this whole era of the very, very late 19th century, the early 20th century, kind of forms a continuum with World War I, and then World War I, to skip ahead a little bit, forms a continuum with World War II. Both together are really one war. It's really one prolonged European civil war that destroyed Western civilization. But it's also important, I think, to situate this in the context of the generations of war. Now I'm only going to go some ways into it to get us to World War I, and then I'll pick this up toward the end, and we'll continue on from World War I. But I'll preface it by saying that these generations of war, which are kind of these successive developments in how war was fought, elements of all of these generations are present in warfare going all the way back to ancient times. It's not like we just discovered, that you can like fight in line and column and then that was it. Like this was going back to, prehistoric times. Even we had elements of all of these things. And the other thing I want to say is that each generation we're going to see kind of abstracts war further and further away from like hand-to-hand or at least man-to-man combat. But before we get to first generation warfare, we basically have ancient warfare. And Dave, you sketched this out a little bit, talking about medieval warfare, knights and ancient warfare, swords and shields and phalanxes and everything like that. We could call this sort of the default or a zeroth generation, I guess. It's kind of basically like skirmish or melee warfare. Everybody kind of knows what we're talking about there. But what first generation warfare was, this is what people call line and column warfare. And this was a change from the gentleman's warfare of the Renaissance and even like the medieval period. Mass conscription came in at this time. And this was a major, major change. Whereas before, in the age of absolutism, especially at the earlier in like the absolutist monarch reigns, basically armies were formed of aristocrats and their immediate retainers and things like that. But one of the innovations in this first generation of war that comes in, I mean, the Napoleonic Wars are really kind of they are the emblem, or probably the best instantiation of this generation, first generation line and column war. Mass conscription becomes a thing. War becomes a matter of mass and scale. It's about getting as many guys onto the battlefield as you can, kind of thing. But there's also still an element of professionalization and even acceleration of this professionalization of warfare, where, yes, you want to basically draft as many able-bodied dudes as you can, but there's also, you have to train them. Whereas knights and like medieval warfare and early modern warfare and everything was also highly professionalized. As I say, this was, you'd have basically a professional equestrian class that was trained in warfare from, birth, basically.
Yeah.
It was often a matter of heredity. These people were highly professionalized, but there was a different kind of professionalization that would come in with the first generation warfare of line and column. You would get these, of course, you're getting hundreds or thousands of men on the field at the same time, and you get these, like, it was all based on very, very elaborate movements and tactical warfare and positioning and things like that on the field. So this also necessitated the development of a very, very rigid and extensive hierarchy of command and control. This is sort of the beginnings of what we kind of think of now as modern military culture. It's what they call command and control. And something else that's different here from earlier forms of warfare, especially in the medieval period and before, is that with first generation warfare, you get nation states rather than tribes, or rather than provinces or smaller conglomerations of men. Now nation states become the main combatants. You're not really getting a war between the House of Habsburg and the House of XYZ or whatever. You're getting these like larger scale wars. So war at this stage kind of undergoes this quantum leap of scale. And it defeats earlier forms of warfare, like equestrian warfare and things like that, by maneuver, right? Because, as I mentioned, you get these elaborate movements on the battlefield. That's first generation warfare. After this, you get, of course, second generation warfare, and this is where we get to World War I, or just before World War I. But World War I is the emblematic industrial warfare. This is second generation, where the Industrial Revolution is long. I mean, it's been in full swing for a long time. Nations are now fully fledged. They're completely ensconced in mass production. And here in this type of warfare, because, I mean, it takes a lot of, in medieval warfare, of course, the smith is going to make your armor and your sword and your shield and everything like that. But it's basically still a very localized kind of economy of warfare. With the Industrial Revolution and with the warfare expanding into this line and column mass and scale warfare and beyond, mass production becomes very, very important to this. And the home front itself becomes really important. Economics here, and the economics of the nation in war, becomes more of a factor than ever. And in fact, Germany, after it loses World War I, third generation warfare, which we'll talk about later, is developed with the understanding that Germany probably lost the war because it was economically inferior to the other powers. So economics is very important, mass production is very important, and technology itself is more of a factor than ever before. And this is what gets us to the topic that we're talking about here. We get artillery. I mean, artillery was a thing going back a long, long way, and firepower and all that. But it becomes so much more important here than it ever has been, as Dave mentioned, with the development of the Gatling gun and the machine gun and everything like that. We also talked about chemical warfare. This, super important, would not have been remotely possible without the developments of the 19th century. The deciphering of the periodic table and the development of modern chemistry and everything like that. We also mentioned helmets. I mean, this is something that seems quite obvious, but it took a little bit of experience to realize that this kind of thing was needed. And another very important technical innovation that often gets passed over, but was absolutely critical to World War I, is the development of radio. So here we get mass communications, here we get remote communications. Warfare now becomes somewhat deterritorialized, where you can, if not relay information to the train that's going off to start World War I, you can at least relay information between generals and whatnot on the battlefield and everything. We also get the development of something that seems quite prosaic, but made a huge difference to the dynamic of warfare. We get barbed wire. So this was a nightmare for these people. In the same way as the trenches themselves, this is an important part of why the trenches even exist in the first place. It's not just because there's machine guns and you're going to get your head blown off and you have to kind of dig in, like literally dig into the earth. This warfare slows down to a crawl at this stage compared to earlier forms of warfare. And part of that slowing down of advance, you might be fighting for a week to advance a couple of kilometers or something like that.
Yeah.
Part of the slowing down of warfare is the use of barbed wire. And there are many others that we could talk about, many other technical innovations, but those are some of the main ones. And what we have here is, rather than maneuver, which was kind of the reason why first generation warfare defeated medieval and earlier warfare, this line and column superior to the earlier forms, what made second generation warfare superior to line and column was not maneuver, because of course maneuver doesn't matter if you're hunkered down in a trench, not so much. What really defeats first generation warfare is the idea of attrition. So what you're doing is you're trying to wear the enemy down. You're wearing him down in terms of his supply lines, wearing him down in terms of his investment in the war, operational costs, psychological costs. This was one of the first wars where the psychological costs became significant enough to really factor into wider strategy and everything like that. And it's all down to this broadest strategic kind of change towards attrition over maneuver. So anyway, I think that kind of gets us to the front here. So I just wanted to kind of sketch that out, because I think it's really important to understand kind of where things came from, and if not the geopolitical motivations, at least understand the broader currents that kind of brought us to this trench foot, hell is mud and everything kind of warfare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a nasty war. It was a war that was not, and like you mentioned, it wasn't this house versus that house, or it was literally entire nations. And because of the railways and because of their ability to transport this much equipment and men, they weren't just drawing from a pool of a locality of men, they were drawing from entire continents and entire countries and entire nations full of people, right? And it literally became a manufacturing race, right? Became innovation, technological innovation, as well as just a manufacturing competition. Whether or not Britain could out-manufacture Germany, and they did, right? We're talking these artillery guns. One artillery gun would launch something, or a line of artillery guns would launch something to the tune of 200,000 rounds a month, hundreds of thousands of rounds, millions of rounds produced, tens of thousands of guns produced, artillery guns, big cannons and stuff. This was serious stuff. Great Britain literally transformed their country to become a war manufactorum, right? The entire country, all focused their energy on manufacturing for the war, and that's what really won it for them. Plus, with the Americans coming in late to tip the scales, right? The Germans put up a really good fight, but over time, they got overwhelmed. You know what I mean? There's a lot of examples of. Here's another thing: this is before Geneva Convention. They had some treaties and stuff that were put in place to like stop gas attacks and stuff that was just really, really barbaric, but they used it anyways. There was no laws like that. And one example of this is the Americans. When the Americans got involved, Americans were the only country to really use shotguns. So you had these American, like they called them like trench gunners, and they were kind of a reaction to the German stormtroopers. The Germans developed these, what they called stormtroopers. They're these highly trained, highly armored guys. You go look it up. Some of their armor was pretty medieval looking. You know what I mean? They had have helmets with chainmail on them. They had like segmented plate armor. Like it was pretty crazy looking. It was pretty cool, very like diesel punk looking to us now. But in reaction to this, the Americans started these trench gunning guys, and they would literally sneak around, and they would use what was called sound ranging. Between the radio communications, they developed what was called sound ranging. And what this was is they would set up like this contraption of microphones, and based on the machine gun sounds that were going off, they would sort of use like this way of triangulating the location of these machine gun nests. So they would send these trench gunners who, they would completely ditch their rifle and bayonet, because you think about it, a rifle is, these rifles were really long at the time, and then you had a big long bayonet. When you get into a trench that is maybe 3 feet wide and 8 feet deep, you're not going to be wielding this giant long, pretty much a gun as a spear, right? So they just made these makeshift trench clubs. They would take these pieces of wood, and they would put like nails and barbed wire and stuff, and they would just make these clubs, like these bludgeons, these morning stars, out of just and they would hang them from their belt. And what happened is the trench gunners, using their shotguns, which were an innovation of the old 1800s Winchester shotgun, they would go in and they would blast these guys with double O buckshot, right? This is something that was very American. And because of that, the Germans protested. They actually went to whatever council or whatever, and they said, this is creating unnecessary pain and suffering. This is a barbaric weapon that you guys are using, right? And they said that if they catch any Americans with shotguns, they're going to execute them on the spot. This is how impactful some of these very small things were, and how grim this was. I don't know if you guys out there that are gun guys, right? What's the number one gun they say to use for home defense? It's a shotgun. Why? Because it has 0% survival rate. You have a pistol for home defense. Most people that get hit with pistol fire, even big ones like you talking 1911, like a 45. Most people survive those shots. Most people survive rifle shots. Nobody survives a shotgun. There was actually a book written by a guy that was a lifelong cat burglar, and he said that the sound to him, he called them, what did he say? He said it was like the ringing bells calling you to hellfire or something. He described it as like, this is the bell to take us to hell. And what he's describing was the sound of a pump action shotgun, right? You're done. You hear that, you're done. You're cooked. You can't run. This guy doesn't even barely have to aim. He just has to point it in your direction, and then you're dead. It's just going to blow you to pieces. You're done. So these types of weapons that were like, it was almost very medieval, because if you go back to medieval times, they were a lot of times guys were just using axes and bludgeons and staves and stuff that they just found that were like reutilized farm tools. So this had a very very medieval kind of feel to it, in a way that wars previously did not have. Right. So it was a really crazy war. It was a really crazy war. It's very bloody and grim, and they completely ignored laws that were previously obeyed. And it was crazy. You had tanks. This was the first time they used tanks, man. You had the British Mark IV, then you had the German A7V, and these were like iron beasts. When they rolled these things out, they were more used for psychological impact, as Mike was saying about psychology. Can you imagine being some podunk guy from North England or from middle America or from a poor part of Ireland, and you're sitting in the trench and you see this gigantic, 100-ton, iron thing crawling over all of this gore and shattered earth and barbed wire, and it's got machine guns on it. It must have been otherworldly. Like you're seeing some mythological creature for the first time. The sound was terrible with these monstrosities, right? But here's the thing is that they weren't that efficient in the beginning. These things, they would break down a lot. They get stuck in mud. They only moved like 3 miles an hour. They were really archaic, sluggish machines. But the psychological impact of stuff like that, and also of airplanes. Can you imagine seeing airplanes for the first time? You know what I mean? Like you're in this war. You've come on a horse-drawn cart to come to this war. And then all of a sudden there are these like steel dragons going through the sky, dropping gas and bombs on people. It's incredible. Now, at first, the planes were used for reconnaissance. The British used them for reconnaissance. But then the Germans developed a timed machine gun that could shoot bullets in between the propeller gaps. So then the British reconnaissance team, the pilot team, they started calling it the Suicide Club, because it was like pretty much everybody died there. It was like the average lifespan of somebody in British aerial reconnaissance was something like 6 days or something ridiculous like that, and like the majority of them died. So if you got pushed into the aerial reconnaissance, they just had nothing. And then they developed that. And then they started developing bombers, right? Airplane bombers. There's dog fights. This was a crazy, crazy war that went from, in a few short years, went from like 0 to 100. It was literally the transformation of all world technology just forged on the battlefield, a battle that was never seen like that before. That was grim and bloody. And the guys, there's this meme that gets said a lot, like, and it gets used a lot to say like modern soldiers are like pussies compared to the old time soldiers who came back and they were tough and blah, 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 blah. It's not true. These guys that came back from World War I were messed up. Now, if you talk to them, obviously they were a different culture than us. They'd be like, "Oh, war is war. I did what I had to do. Blah, blah, kill or be killed." That's what they would say. But the fact of the matter is that these guys were pretty messed up. My great grandfather fought in World War I. And my grandfather told the story that my great grandfather would snap out. He would be impulsively violent. He would be irrational at times. And he, would have crazy nightmares. He drank a lot. Like this was a guy that was, and my great grandfather was a tough man. He was a, coal miner, farmer guy from rural Pennsylvania, this time. And also, here's another thing about World War I in the United States that people don't realize. People of German descent in World War I got treated like shit. This is where Germanophobia comes from. That during this time in here in Pennsylvania, it was very, very common for people to speak Pennsylvania German, to speak Dutch, right? It was like our second language. After World War I, that got quelled. You weren't allowed to speak it in school. You weren't allowed to speak it in public. If you had a German-sounding name, you would get treated like shit. I had an uncle that got taken away to a labor camp or something because he was accused of being a spy. You know what I mean? He's somebody. My dad's family landed here in 1689. They haven't had connections with that country in like centuries, and they fucking hauled the guy off because his last name sounded German. So it's like there's a lot of dark history around here in the United States in regards to World War I and the way that they treated German people here. That's something that needs to be mentioned.
Yeah, actually, that it's interesting that you ended on that, because what I was thinking when you were talking a little bit about this, like, the country bumpkin guy in the trenches that's like watching this Lovecraftian machine that's just like lumbering over just gore and broken earth and everything like that, or like watching the dog fights or whatever, like these dragons in the sky raining fire down upon people and all of this crazy stuff. requiring like a mass production beyond anything that would have been thinkable, like even remotely thinkable 100 years before. What I was thinking as you were describing that is just the sort of blur between the home front and the battlefield, where, of course, bullets are not flying at home, but people at home are involved in the war, right? This is where the separation between battlefield and home front starts to get narrowed. And as we'll see later when I go through the rest of the generations of warfare, that keeps happening, and it keeps getting more and more blurred to where now basically everybody is potentially an enemy. But that's kind of beginning and really accelerating during industrial warfare, during the second generation of warfare. And of course, it also dovetails with what you just said about your great-grandfather, because since war now is very much closer to home, since the enemy could be in your midst, since like even just people not playing their part and being like Rosie the Riveter like they're supposed to be, not being behind the war effort quite enough, this is enough to possibly tank strategic objectives and the war effort and everything. So we're moving towards now what has been called the totalization of war, or total war, right? Where everybody is involved, even the civilians are involved. Now there may yet be laws of war that prevent the killing of civilians and everything like that. But of course, civilians are intimately involved in the war effort in a way that they were not in the Middle Ages, in the like Renaissance, early modern periods, and everything like that. There was a much clearer separation between the professional fighting force and the peasant, basically working the land. This is not the case in World War I. In World War I, these kind of things these worlds start to become kind of blended together and entangled with each other. And this is why, this plus the pure technical advancement that World War I kind of rested upon tactically is why we're kind of focusing on this particular war, because the topic at hand that we were originally tossed around for this episode was the mechanization of warfare and how technology influences the fighting of wars. And of course, World War I is the war where that becomes the most obvious. And I think it kind of, in some ways, the technical aspect of warfare, just the pure gore, the pure horrificness of the war, kind of in some ways overshadows what the war was even about in the first place. Now, of course, it was geopolitically complicated. There was a lot of factors going into it. There was these, insanely complicated entanglements and alliances. There was colonialism and the fact that some of the great powers were very much behind the curve in terms of colonialization. There was, as Dave mentioned, there were these kind of like family alliances that ended up having to be, kind of broken over wider geopolitical interests and everything like that. But at the end of the day, nobody really remembers any of that stuff. What they remember is the machine gun. What they remember is the mustard gas. What they remember is the trench foot and all these like horrible things about the experience of the war. And it's really the technical aspects of war in this war that actually overshadow everything else. So this is something quite different. We can think about, most people are vaguely aware, at least, of what the Napoleonic Wars were fought over. Americans know exactly what the Civil War was fought about, the American Revolutionary War and all these things. A lot of people have no idea what the hell World War I was even about, kind of thing. And I think it's because of this technical innovation, as I said before, where the greatest speed of innovation over a whole century at the peak of our genotypic health, all this genius was basically tasked with with trying to figure out how to murder each other as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So this is really like World War I is in some ways like almost unique in the human experience in this way. Obviously, the war was fought over something, but it's kind of been lost in like just the sheer brutality of it all.
Yeah, and like you mentioned about like the IQ of people during this time, these people were just to give you guys an example. My great grandfather, who fought in World War I, he was a coal miner and he was a farmer and everything. He also opened one of the first schools in Pennsylvania. He had multiple college degrees. Like, this guy had to ride a horse to college, which was, miles and miles away across the state, to get degrees. And he got college degrees in a time where, it was like, most people out there, like, literacy was not that common because you just didn't have access to school where he grew up. He had college degrees. He opened a school. He was a photographer and an artist and a musician and, like a farmer, like he was like all of these different things. He was a very brilliant man, very, very brilliant man. And he was probably 140, 150 IQ. Now, people look back at who he was. He was a coal miner. He was one of the poor people that got sent to get killed. Yeah, he was one of the poor people, but my great grandfather walking around today would be a genius. You know what I mean? This guy, you read what this guy wrote. Like, I have like letters and stuff, and I have like little photographs where he wrote things on the back, and he has like, there's still pieces of his journal left. And the command that this guy had of the English language was like, people get published nowadays. There's like famous authors nowadays who don't have the command of the English language that this guy did. Him and his buddies just writing letters back and forth. These people on average were brilliant. They were brilliant people. Compared to us today, and he got sent to war. I mean, not even any sort of special thing. He didn't get sent over there to be an engineer. He didn't get sent over there to be a scientist. He didn't get sent over there to invent airplanes. He got sent over there to fight in the trenches. He got sent over there to kill and shoot and fight in the muck, in the mud, in the gore, and the blood. That's what my great grandfather did, and it's just testament to how smart people were back then. My great grandfather was. If you look him up now, if you think about him now, you find the pictures of him now. You're like, oh, this guy was a coal miner. This guy was just a farmer, and he was a coal miner and a farmer, and all of these things. However, this guy was brilliant, right? He was. At this time, he was like smarter than that. He was an exceptional man, right? In his community, at least. He was a photographer. He was an artist. He had multiple college degrees. He was, a musician. He was like all of the above. He was a pastor. That was like his big thing. He was actually like a pastor. He had, he would give like, he was like a religious leader and like he was like all of the above. But this guy who was nowadays, if my great grandfather was walking around nowadays, he would be considered like a genius. He wasn't a genius back then. He was just considered a pretty smart guy. This guy's pretty smart. He was a little bit above average for the time. And this guy who probably had 140, 150, maybe 160 IQ was sent to go fight in the muck, in the mud, in the blood, and the gore, in the trenches. He didn't get sent over there to invent airplanes or to be an engineer for tanks or anything, right? He got sent over there to be a grunt, to fight and kill. You know what I mean? So this just goes to show, this is just testament to like the average person that was walking around during that time was just way smarter than we are today. It's just the fact of the matter, right? Now I like to think of some of those genes bled over, because my grandfather, who fought in World War II, which is another example. My grandfather was also a coal miner, but he was the first one in my father's family to leave the mines and the farming and go. He became an engineer after the war. So he literally went and became an engineer and did really well for himself. But he's like your typical yeoman farmer. He was a beekeeper. He was a farmer. He was an engineer. He was a woodworker. He was, this guy was incredible. He could build anything. After he passed away, I got his library. He's got books on he was adept in calculus and theology and philosophy. Right here, I have his copy of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations from the Great Books Foundation. This is like from who knows when. I have no idea how old this thing is, but he's got notes written throughout it. My grandfather, these guys were brilliant. You know what I mean? They got sent overseas to go kill people and to get shot at and to fight in the mud. They weren't, utilized. So this is just evidence for the kind of people that were just disposable back then. We're talking guys that we consider geniuses now were completely disposable back then, or at least they treated them as such. So it was a completely different time back then. And when these guys came back from the war, everything was completely different, and it was different for everybody. And this was the time. This was literally the shift, because you had the czars, you had the Kaisers, you still had royal families running things. After that, it was like the final culmination of liberalism. I actually believe that the end of Western civilization happened in the world wars, because all of our genius men and all of our best men went just like to die by the tens of millions. And then all of our old reigning aristocracies got overthrown or massacred or whatever, and liberalism became its final culmination, which is these modern monstrous democracies. And we've just been living under the shadow of the corpse of Western civilization for 80 years now. That's my take.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that mass democracy comes in right around this time. But yeah, to pick up on what you were saying there, World War I was certainly one of the most, perhaps the most severely dysgenic event in all of human history, where not only did a huge chunk of the young men of the time die, but in many cases it was some of the best, because mass conscription was a thing. Like Ludwig Wittgenstein wrote his Tractatus Logico Philosophicus in the trenches. We've published our anthology of English verse. There is some World War I poetry in there. Just brilliant people fighting in the trenches. Tolkien fought in the World War I trenches. Yeah. This is the cream of Western genius was fighting in World War I. And how many of these people just got completely wiped out before they ever got to achieve anything, right? This was a massively dysgenic event that has reverberations all the way down to modern times. And it's very chilling to think of what kind of an effect that would have had, not just, because a lot of high quality, European genes got eliminated from the gene pool, but also just the fact that, genotypically, males themselves are more there's more variability. The bell curve of male IQ and of course everything else that goes into personality is much flatter. And this means that you've got more extreme lows, severely psychopathic or idiotic men, but also you have extreme highs. You've got supreme genius, and you got more people, vastly orders of magnitude more people who are at the 180, 190, 200 IQ level that are men than women, because of this flatter bell curve sort of thing. And because of the wide variability of the male genome, the genotype, having all of that wiped out, basically having a good chunk of the Y chromosomes of the Europeans wiped out in this one event, reduced, European genotypic diversity severely, compared to almost anything else that you could imagine, except for on the scale of a pre-modern genocide or something like that. So this had a massive effect and everything. And of course, as you mentioned, mass democracy comes in sort of soon, right around this time, maybe slightly before, but also it certainly accelerates after this. Democracy is a thing that is kind of in our sphere, I mean, people are sort of hot and cold on it. Some people are all about democracy. Greg Johnson considers himself very much a Democrat and everything like that. But a lot of, I come out of sort of my genealogy of getting into this scene is through neo-reaction, which is like stridently anti-democratic. And I certainly bear some of the stamp of that. Democracy, I think, is a travesty. But mass democracy sort of comes in at this time where the bourgeois liberalism of Henry Sumner Maine or Lecky or Francois Guizot and people like that sort of gets usurped at this point. I mentioned that I talked a little bit about this in my long Substack article recently, where bourgeois liberalism basically at this stage cannot sort of maintain, based on its liberal priors of egalitarianism and especially freedom and being sort of decoupled from your ancestral throne ascribed identities. Based on this ideology, bourgeois liberalism can no longer argue that the lower classes are unable to govern themselves or participate in government and everything. And this is kind of where at least the ideological roots of mass democracy come into play and everything. And of course, World War I, because of the severe dysgenic event and everything, and some of what was going on ideologically at this time with the irrationalism and especially the political radicalism that it kind of brought this unstable environment where socialism could kind of flourish in places that it had not flourished before, like places like England or in Germany and other places like that, and certainly in Russia. This unstable environment of political radicalism kind of allowed some of the more unfortunate currents of the 20th century to kind of like come to the fore and everything. So it's not just about the technical aspect of war, just the sheer scale and tragedy of World War I sort of opened the door to a lot of the things that were very, very lamentable about the 20th century. Of course, it also brought things like fascism and other ideologies that we would be perhaps a little bit more sympathetic to than certainly communism. But, it was a turning point. I mean, something like fascism, even, as laudable as it is in some ways, would not have been remotely thinkable, like 50 years before that. But it was really sort of the experience of World War I and the mobilization, the totalization of war, like the idea of totalitarianism, of the total society completely integrated from top to tail in terms of its economy, in terms of its culture, in terms of its military, in terms of everything, was in some ways a kind of legacy of World War I, where you get, as we said before, this compression between war and the home front and the economy and everything like that, where when it's said that politics is a continuation of war by other means, this is in some ways, I mean, the quote predates World War I, but World War I makes that absolutely clear sort of thing. So it had certainly cultural downstream consequences as well as technical ones.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, Mr. Mike, we're coming up on an hour 15. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about with World War I? You want to keep going?
Well, I think we pretty much said all that needs to be said about World War I. I did want to go through some of the rest of the generations of war, because I think I think the audience will find that interesting, and it kind of gets us to where we are today. It kind of takes us from World War I to that. So World War I, second generation warfare, industrial war, is succeeded by, of course, World War II, which the sort of emblematic third generation warfare is World War II, which we think of as blitzkrieg. And of course, technical innovation doesn't stop at World War I. It continues We get the development of the internal combustion engine that gives like much, much greater mobility to the aspects of war, to certainly things like tanks and the Air Force and submarines. And we get like missile technology and things like that. And what this does is it enables indirect engagement with the enemy. So you strike at the enemy kind of without seeing them, or in indirect fire, or at least not face to face kind of thing. And strike capability becomes absolutely crucial with blitzkrieg. Speed becomes a factor as well. And now because of the combustion engine, we don't have these sort of like lumbering zeppelins or even like these box airplanes and things like that that we had before. Speed is absolutely critical. You get these very, very fast planes, very fast moving, at least for the time, fast moving tanks and cars and things like that. You need to be able to kind of strike at these deep targets quickly and then get the fuck out of Dodge, right? So what blitzkrieg does, we said before that first generation warfare, so line and column, overcomes earlier forms of warfare by its maneuver. That's its sort of main strategy. And then second generation warfare kind of makes maneuver obsolete, and it brings attrition, like that's its main strategy. Well, third generation blitzkrieg warfare defeats the second generation industrial warfare by maneuver. So you kind of get this like reversion to a kind of more like movement oriented style of war. And then after that, after the third generation warfare, which basically like the last real third gen warfare was probably Korea. After that, you get Vietnam. And what Vietnam is really the first, or mainly the first, fourth generation warfare, which is called irregular warfare, but we know it as guerrilla warfare. And this is where the friend-enemy distinction really becomes blurred. This is kind of a new dynamic in warfare. Again, we can relate it back to what was said before about how the front is kind of pushed back. It's not clear where it is. It gets kind of obscured. For a young man fighting in Vietnam, especially the American side, the enemy could be anywhere. And this really brings it amplifies the psychological aspects of warfare in a way even that sort of surpasses World War I. I mean, of course, World War I is horrific in ways that the Vietnam War maybe isn't, but Vietnam is psychologically damaging in a whole other way, where when you go back, not only are you kind of shell-shocked, but you also are distrustful and don't trust your senses and everything like that.
Yeah.
And also guerrilla warfare, what it does, and this is, again, very new. In fact, it's completely new. It makes warfare asymmetrical. So whereas before, from first generation warfare all the way up to like World War II, the advantage is given to the larger country, to the more developed country that has a bigger industrial base and everything like that. That changes with guerrilla warfare, where you get asymmetrical warfare in the other direction. In some ways, it's actually, small is beautiful, right? And the aggressor is really kind of put at the disadvantage. What you want to do if you're fighting a guerrilla warfare is you want to be fighting on your home turf. It gives the defensive advantage. And another sort of aspect to this asymmetrical warfare is that culture and ideology becomes especially important. Obviously, World War II especially, but maybe not even as much as people think. And certainly normies think. World War II ideology was somewhat important, but it was really more geopolitical interests that were driving it. And it's been retconned as this like good versus evil, but we all know that that's not the case. Mm-hmm. But in Vietnam, certainly there was an ideological component to it. And culture, whether it's military culture or otherwise, an ideology becomes important. Do you have the will to hold out, right? What are you fighting for? This is something that was a real problem for Americans in the Vietnam War, right? Like they didn't, especially towards the end of it, didn't really believe in it. And this was a big problem. So nation states kind of lose their monopoly on waging war. And you can see this especially really the last guerrilla war, irregular war is kind of Afghanistan, but even that's verging on something else, where you basically had like this tribal structure of the Taliban versus, the might of this post-industrial American state, and which one of those won, right? Nation states don't necessarily win anymore. To a degree, and this would even be perfected by like the next generation, fifth generation, the goal is not really to win, but actually to cripple the enemy's society as well. So it like war continues to become more and more totalized. It's now about also ideology and destroying the enemy's like will to live and what he believes in. Campaigns get prolonged. Obviously, Vietnam as the kind of paradigmatic war here was very long. Supply lines and morale were major issues that they imposed. The Vietnamese imposed huge operational costs on the Americans, and the psychological costs of war were very high. Again, we keep going back and forth between maneuver and attrition. Fourth generation warfare gets us back to attrition, like World War I, right? You're there to basically hold out until the enemy knuckles under, rather than to like defeat him in this this really crazy, pitched battle of maneuvers and things like that. So anyway, from there we get into fifth generation warfare, which is really actually an extension of fourth generation. May not even be totally distinct. And this is what's called unrestricted warfare, or what we might call info wars, right? And this kind of depends on modern decentralized media. You get like, social engineering is important. People like one of the main sort of like, arsenals of this war is things like misinformation or foreign influence campaigns. Like, are you a Russian bot or are you, a deep state gay op, right? That kind of thing. Non-state actors become really important. You get like, everyone's a Fed, could be a terrorist. Non-state actors like NGOs become super important. You get like the rise of NGOs as like instruments of war, and of course color revolutions, where the U.S. State Department goes into these places that are sort of on the frontiers of the enemy's territory, and basically like runs these gay ops that like topple their governments and things like that. This was really big in the Cold War, of course. And so again, we get this sort of obscuring of the front. The front gets even more obscure than it was in guerrilla warfare. So now the battle is kind of like pushed even to the home front. Now the battle is kind of being waged at home, even by the aggressor. Like the front becomes kind of universalized. The battlefield moves to home, where you get these non-state actors that are acting against governments at home. Anybody could be an enemy, and the asymmetry of war that I mentioned with the guerrilla war gets expanded even more. So war can be waged at a distance by like a bot, and you get the rise of cyber warfare, where like war could be waged even just anonymously with a computer by AI automatically, kind of thing. Yeah. So again, things are getting even more asymmetrical. Cryptography was always important all the way back to like, World War I, but it becomes even more important now. And you get economic warfare, where states can like wage warfare against other states, but disinformation makes it easy for non-state actors to kind of like fuck with other people, like other economies and everything. Basically what we get here with fifth generation warfare, and this is what kind of makes it different than guerrilla warfare. It is fundamentally ideological warfare. The ideology of the home front is really at stake. It's kind of like a battle. It really is a battle for hearts and minds. It's like a war on morale and motivation, where the war is kind of being waged against the strategic objectives of war, against the enemy's perception of the legitimacy of their war effort, right? And it's also kind of a warfare that depends entirely on propositional identity as well. You get this war on like abstractions. You get war on terror or on drugs or on poverty. You get like war. It's always a war against an idea, like a statement or a proposition kind of thing. So the war of like one people against another, it's always like, I mean, it's always there. It's always in the background, but it's kind of sublimated into this propositional warfare. And in some ways, it is kind of a return to ancient warfare, where it's almost like people carrying their gods into battle kind of thing. And of course, this all imposes like massive operational costs. It basically, what the objective of warfare today is it's to make governance impossible. It's to impose costs on governments. And you get this like, the friend-enemy distinction is totally obliterated. Civilians are now psychological casualties of war. The strategy of attrition is just even more expanded than it is in fourth-generation warfare. So to kind of sum it all up, each subsequent generation is abstracting people away from the battlefield. Each generation is meant to kind of like beat the last generation before it even reaches the front. War is just getting even more abstract. And this all, like the turning point here that really sort of accelerates all of this is the mechanization of warfare in World War I. So, it's important to understand World War I. It's important to understand this sort of the turn of the century, what was going on at this time, because it really is, as we mentioned at the beginning, the big bang of a lot of what's going on today. It's really hard to understand what warfare is even about today without understanding the roots of how it changed at that time.
Yeah. You mentioned we really started to see like the fifth generation warfare start to bloom during Vietnam. Really, you mentioned how in Vietnam it was kind of this guerrilla warfare and everything like that, which is true. You mentioned this blurring of lines and everything like that of who friend enemy distinction. Due to the soldiers in Vietnam, a lot of times had trouble discerning like friendlies from the Viet Cong, because they would wear the same clothes a lot of the times, and they're in these dense, deep jungles. They're far away from home. There's parasites. Dude, Vietnam sucked. And actually, in preparation for this show, I ended up watching a lot of interviews with Vietnam vets that were like in the shit in Vietnam, and just their stories were incredible. Just really incredible what these guys went through. Morale was horrible among the troops. They had no idea why they were there. A lot of these guys were conscripted. They were a lot of them. And they also had, speaking of taking the highest IQ, if you were in college at the time, you got put up further in priority for the draft board. So the draft board was grabbing all of the country's brightest and sending them, and it was like rapid fire. They'd pick you up, they'd send you to boot camp, and then you would just go to war. And a lot of these guys, were from cities and stuff like they've never like really held a rifle before, been in the woods too much. Imagine if you grow up in New York City, where you probably never like your experience with guns is probably you have a 9mm right in your waistband just in case you get robbed. That's your experience with firearms, and you've never like been out in the woods outside of maybe like a school trip or something. Right. So you get thrusted into this far flung primitive country that's jungle and all of this kind of stuff. And there's punji pits, there's traps, there's bullshit. They literally send you there. They teach you how to hold a rifle. They teach you, XYZ. And now you have to learn on the fly. And they really did too. When you first got to Vietnam, you did what you did point, which means you were the guy up front. If you were a noob, the moment you got there, they're like, okay, time to do point and learn the ropes. So you literally had to learn how to fight in Vietnam by not dying, by trying to spot ambushes and all kinds of stuff. They literally waged a Fabian war. Now, war of attrition is not a new thing, right? A lot of times it's called Fabian warfare because it's based off a Roman emperor that used to wage wars of attrition and bleed enemies of resources before ever even attacking, right? And this was something that happened in Vietnam. And you're mentioning about the blurring of your friend enemy distinction. I worked with a guy who was a Vietnam veteran, and one of the things that he said that he carries a lot of guilt over with in Vietnam was when they were in the jungle. They were stuck in the jungle for a long time, apparently, and they were like looking for these guys that kept running ambushes. Now, the Viet Cong were tough. Like, we got to understand, in the 60s, the guys that went to war from America in the 60s were not the same kind of guys that went to war in World War I. These are guys that grew up in air conditioning. These are guys that had TV. These are guys that didn't really know what it's like to be hungry. They bought all their food from supermarkets. They weren't hard and grim and lank like the guys from 1915, right? These were modern guys. So you send these modern guys to go fight these Viet Cong, who are these guys that grew up in the jungle, that grew up in warfare, that grew up. They have underground tunnel systems that they've dug that have been there for decades. This is a war that's been ongoing forever and ever and ever, and these guys are tough. The Viet Cong were tough. You could go watch videos with these interviews, and they talk about how they shoot these Viet Cong, and they just keep coming and coming and coming. He's like, I don't even know what these motherfuckers were made of. They're these little guys. They're agile. They know their weapons. They're completely fucking ruthless. And on top of it, they're tough as nails, right? These guys are just bloodthirsty animals. And the Americans, they're not built for that anymore, that kind of like brutality anymore. So they had to go fight these kinds of guys. But this fellow that I worked with, he told me this story about they were looking for this small group of Viet Cong, like guys that were doing ambushes. They took out like a lot of their camps, and these guys were just a menace. So they found them, right? They found, because the Viet Cong, they would build these little tiny encampments in the jungle and hide, and that's where they would sleep, and that's where they would do their operations from. So they found this little outcropping of tents in the jungle, and in the middle of the night, they snuck up there and hacked these people to death with machetes in the middle of the night before they could even wake up. They snuck up on them, hacked them to death with machetes. And when they drug the bodies out, they found that they weren't Viet Cong. They were Vietnamese. They was their friends. And they couldn't tell the difference because they wore the same clothes. They looked the same. They were ethnically the same. So they had no idea. So their captain, the guy that their sergeant said, pile the bodies and burn them and hide it, right? Because if it comes out that we hacked these guys to death, we're going to be in big fucking trouble. So he said, he did this. And here's another thing that was going on with the Viet Cong is you had Chinese that were coming to fight. You had North Vietnamese that were coming to fight on the side of the Viet Cong. So ethnicity once you're there for a while, you can start telling the difference between the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese and the Chinese and these guys. You know what I mean? You're around these people enough, you can start seeing they have different phenotypes, right? The Viet Cong they had a lot of different people from different places, and it was very confusing. And speaking of fifth generation warfare, and then I'm getting to my point here, is that while all of this was going on, we weren't just fighting the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong. We were fighting communism. And when we were fighting communism in Vietnam, Russia was waging a fifth generation war on us, right? A lot of like the late hippie movement were KGB agents and shit. Like, this is admitted. This is in their files. These people have admitted to it. You know, the Weather Underground, which were a leftoid hippie terrorist organization, they admit now. They're actually, some of these guys are not now because they're really old, but that went on to be college professors after blowing places up and killing people. Like, they're like college professors now. And these guys were in contact and trained by KGB. So like this kind of color revolution, like not at first, but the late hippie movement was effectively a Russian color revolution on us. It was fifth generation warfare. So this has been going on for a long, long time.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you could even push it back into the 1950s and everything with McCarthyism, which in the fullness of time has turned out to be absolutely justified. It's now clear based on like hard historical data that, you know, the U.S. State Department and many aspects of the U.S. government were staffed with communists. Like this is just a thing now, whereas before it was thought to be a conspiracy theory, right? And this is just all another aspect of the fifth generation warfare and the fourth generation, where you get this sort of ideology becomes the battlefront as much as like the physical battlefield kind of thing. And this is kind of where we're at now, right? Fifth generation warfare. We are ensconced in fifth generation warfare. I mean, what the hell do you think that the COVID era was all about, right? It was just basically about enshrining this like loser ideology, and it's sort of, you know, pasting it on top of like old stock Americans. And in some sense, like it's kind of like a victory lap and like, you know, just shoving it in their faces, this like, you know, woke ideology or GNC or whatever you want to call it. This is it's the same thing by a different name. And fifth generation warfare is just basically, you know, ideological or informational warfare, where, you know, everyone is potentially a Russian bot or a foreign influencer and everything like that. It's just like the front is completely pushed back to the home, and, you know, it's like the friend enemy distinction is completely contaminated, sort of thing. So you can understand why the deep state is so worried about things like institutional trust in democracy, you know, our democracy, all these like, you know, ideographs, all these things that like are just sort of emblems for something at the end of the day, probably generally like ethnic. All these things, this is the front that war is being waged on now. And this is why dissidents are in the crosshairs, right? Because we stand for something much older, much deeper, and much more perennial than, you know, the liberal deep state and everything like that. So in a sense, we are kind of like the enemy combatants, and they take this very, very seriously. But yeah, it's this has been going on forever, right? As you mentioned, the Fabian strategy, right? With the one of the Roman emperors during the during the wars with Carthage would basically avoid pitched battles and try and wear the enemy down. And again, a war of attrition kind of thing. This is like ancient fourth generation warfare. You could think of, you know, the first generation line and column warfare in the ancient world as the phalanx. You could think of, you know, artillery or sort of the ancient equivalent of that as something like the trebuchet. You could think of the blitzkrieg. You could think of something like cavalry, right? And fifth generation warfare, InfoWars, or ideological warfare, you could think of something like missionaries, right? Where like the Indian Emperor Ashoka would send missionaries to spread Buddhism to his enemies and his rivals and everything, to try and topple their like ideological and religious imperatives, sort of thing. The idea, and this again goes back to fourth generation warfare, is not just to win. It's to erase the enemy and to destroy him completely, to bring about the total collapse of his society. So while, you know, second generation warfare, trench warfare, industrial warfare, of course, very insidious, in some sense, fifth generation warfare is even more destructive, because you're not just like there to win. You're not just there to like subjugate another people. You're there to erase that people, at least to erase them propositionally. So yeah, this is warfare has certainly evolved over the years, and it's not just technologically, it's also evolved in terms of social technology as well. So we are in a war of our own, and the stakes are just as high, even if bullets aren't flying. So this is why I think, we in the dissident movement need to take our shit seriously. And as much and fun as it is to make it about memes and everything like that, this is a real thing. We are carrying our gods into battle. And the enemy is doing the same, and it's not clear who's going to win at this point. I think we're going to win for reasons that kind of go beyond this podcast, but we need to fight, and we need to take it seriously. We need to treat it like warfare, which it actually is. So yeah, I think that would basically be my final word on the matter.
Yeah, it's very possible that warfare, just the act of sending soldiers into battle, is sort of obsolete at this point. They don't even really need to do that anymore. And if in the future, when they do need to do that, they'll probably send robots. They're already sending drones. And most attacks now are carried out by drones. Soldiers are becoming an obsolete thing. And they don't even really need to send drones anymore, because they can just send a color revolution and subvert your society and collapse it from the inside. So this is the battlefield is virtual, is abstract now.
Yeah, well, I mean, Sun Tzu, the author of The Art of War, says that every battle is won before it's ever fought. So this really actually, in a nutshell, kind of encapsulates what the generations of war are about. First generation warfare is meant to preempt the ancient warfare. Second generation is meant to make first obsolete, all the way down to today, where fifth generation warfare is basically made to make guerrilla warfare obsolete. So who knows what comes next? Is it even possible that anything does come after ideological warfare? Or really what it is, it's religious warfare. It's a matter of religious imperatives warring against each other. I really, I'm not kidding when I say that men carry their gods into battle. This is really what it comes down to. These are fundamentally theological wars that are being waged between, many different combatants, but we're certainly among them. So it is frustrating to see people not take it seriously, like it's all a big fucking game.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've made the argument for years that liberalism is a religion. There's no way. Has all of the trappings, all of the functions of a religion, and the people that believe in it are some of the most fanatical, bloodthirsty, unforgiving. They're just some of the biggest fanatical cultists the world has ever seen. So it's a holy war. We are in a holy war, in my opinion.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, very good. All right, awesome show. All right, is there anything else you'd like to say? You want to wrap it up, Mr. Mike?
Yeah, let's close it out.
Beautiful. All right, everybody, appreciate you guys tuning in. Hails and blessings to each and every one of you and your wonderful, beautiful families. Make sure, if you're not already, which if you're listening at this point, it means you probably are, but if you're not already, go over to imperiumpress.org/podcast and go sign up for the Gumroad. Get all kinds of awesome perks like hardback books and most importantly, Culture Dads. You get Culture Dads every single week coming from us. We're on the weekly basis now, but don't sleep on those hardbacks. I got some of them. Beautiful, beautiful books that have foreverness, right? I can't, these are books I'm going to give to my kids. So beautiful stuff, awesome stuff. And support Imperium Press that way by signing up for the Gumroad so they can grow into the institution that they were destined to become. Help them grow into this monument that stands with immortality, like the pyramids or the aqueducts. So go sign up over there. You're going to check out what I'm doing. Go over to thebizarrearchives.com and buy some books. Horror Beneath just dropped. It's only like $9. You can't beat it. $9. You can find that in your couch. You got $9. Come on. Buy a copy of The Horror Beneath by C.P. Webster. You're going to love it. Great cosmic horror mystery. Grab that over at thebizarrearchives.com. Follow us on Twitter and Telegram at The Bizarrearchives. And I will see you guys next time here on Culture Dads. Set.